Welcome to the lecture on cellular POTS models within our natural computing course. So last week I talked to you about cellular automata, and the cellular POTS model is one specific kind of cellular automaton, a fairly sophisticated one, that is used in biology to model complicated tissue environments. So first let's look again at this picture, which I also showed last week. This picture, as I mentioned last week, is a screenshot of a cellular automaton simulation of T cells moving in a lymph node. And this picture is an example of a 3D cellular automata simulation built using the cellular POTS model. So here let's look at a different example, which is a two-dimensional layer of cells. So these gray cells are meant to be keratinocytes, which are cells of the epidermis, the outermost layer of the skin. In the middle in gray you can see one darker cell, which is a tumor cell that is going to start growing once I start the simulation. So when I clicked on the start button here, a lot of things are going to happen. So the first thing that will happen is that this tumor cell is going to start dividing and is going to create more tumor cells as it grows. And then you can see in red these other cells appearing, and these are meant to represent T cells. These T cells are crawling around in this epidermis, and they are localizing the tumor by means of a chemokine that is being secreted by the tumor cells, and they're being attracted towards the tumor cells. So as you can see, there's a lot of dynamics going on here. The gray cells are fairly stiff, they barely move. The dark gray tumor cells are a bit more aggressive. They are protruding into the outer epidermal area. And these red T cells are, they have a fairly complicated shape, so you can see them extending these small dendrites as they really try to squeeze themselves in between the skin cells. So as you can see, there's quite a lot going on here. And the interesting thing is that this relatively complicated simulation has nevertheless been made using a fairly simple cellular automaton model with just a few basic rules. And what I will try to do in this lecture is explain the rules that we use to generate a simulation like this. So how does this cellular POTS model work? So as in any cellular automaton, everything is based on a grid. In this case we have a two-dimensional grid, but it could also be three-dimensional. This grid contains pixels, and these pixels can have different identities. In this picture here, these identities are just being depicted as different integers. So on this example grid, we have three different identities, 1, 2, and 3, and these other white pixels, they would have a default or background identity, which we could label with a 0. So now in the cellular POTS model, multiple pixels of the same identity form a cell. So that's a bit confusing when you compare it to other cellular automata, because normally in cellular automata you say that a cell is one of these pixels. And as I told you last week, that's the reason that in this course I'm not talking about cells but about pixels, because in this specific model a cell is actually a collection of multiple pixels. So in this example we have three different cells, and each consists of different pixels, but we can group multiple cells together and treat them as the same cell type. So for example, in the previous simulation you will have seen a lot of cells of the epidermis that all have the same type, but they all also have different identities. So basically a cell type would be a grouping of multiple cells that have very similar or the same properties. Now let's look a bit more closely into how the cellular POTS model actually works. And I'm going to do that by first explaining a simpler version of this model, which we call simply the POTS model. So it's important to point out here that the POTS model itself has nothing to do with cells yet, but it's going to be used as a building block of the cellular POTS model because it has a certain property that is going to be very useful in modeling cells, and we are going to see that later. But first let's focus on what the basic POTS model looks like. And the POTS model is perhaps easiest explained by considering the grid that we were looking at in the previous slide as a graph structure. So if you view a grid as a graph, then you could say each pixel is a node. So each of these pixels here would be one of the nodes in V. And we assign to each node an integer, which is its identity, just like in the previous slide. And then we have these edges, and the edges basically model the neighborhood function on the grid. So here in this example we are using an 8 neighborhood. That means that each node is connected to each 8 immediate neighbors on the grid. But we could also change that and connect it, for example, only to the horizontal and the vertical neighbors. So now, in addition to these nodes and node identities and edges, we define an energy function. And this energy function is called a Hamiltonian, so that's what this letter H stands for. The energy function counts basically the number of edges on the grid where the two adjacent endpoints, the two nodes adjacent to the edge, have different colors. And that's achieved by this Dirac delta function here. So the Dirac delta function is 1 if its arguments are not equal, and it's 0 if its arguments are equal. So let's look at this edge here, this bold one. This edge has one red and one white node attached to it, and so it would contribute a 1 to this overall sum. This edge here, however, has two white nodes attached to it, and so it would not contribute anything to this sum. So if we do this sum for this entire grid on the left side, then we are going to see that there are 32 edges where the two endpoints do not have the same color. So the overall energy of this grid would be 32 times j, where j is a parameter of this model. If you compare this to the right-hand side, where we also have 4 red pixels and the rest is white, here we only count 20 edges with endpoints of different colors. So the energy of this grid on the right-hand side would be 20 times j. So if you compare this, then you see that the grid on the right-hand side has a lower energy than the grid on the left-hand side. And now generally in the POTS model, we want to minimize this energy function. So that means that the model is going to try to go to a state that looks like this, where we have a quite small energy function and where changes, for example, changing the position of these this red node here, would only increase the energy function. Talking about the minimizing function or minimizing the energy of the grid means that we have to have some way to get from one state of the grid to another state. And that's where we start talking about simulation of POTS models. So this simulation also doesn't work exactly like a cellular automaton update as you would normally think about it, because in a cellular automaton normally we update all pixels at the same time. But in the POTS model we instead randomly choose one source and neighboring target pixels, so we basically pick a random edge on this graph, and then we are only going to deal with this edge. And then afterwards we're going to pick another random edge and going to deal with that edge and so on. So that means, unlike in a cellular automaton, we're not going to update necessarily the edges in any particular order or all at once, but we're going to randomly jump across the lattice and update random edges. So how does this edge update work? So first we pick one of the edges. Let's suppose on the left side that we pick this edge here. And then we also denominate one of the endpoints as a source and the other as a target. So here let's say that this red node is our source and the white node is our target. So what we're going to consider now is a so-called copy attempt. And that means that the source node in red here is going to try to copy its own color into the target node. In other words, here we are going to consider that the white node might become red. And this change of the color of this node is also going to lead to a change of the energy function on the grid. So now we are going to accept this copy attempt with a certain probability, and that probability is going to depend on a change in energy. If you look at the situation on left here, so what is going to happen is that we have this white node in the middle, which has 8 red neighbors, so it's going to contribute 8 times j to this Hamiltonian function. But after turning this white node into a red node, it would have the same color as all its neighbors, and that means that the energy of the grid on the right-hand side is lower than the energy of the left-hand side. So that means that our delta H, the change in energy, is negative. And if that happens, then we're going to accept the copy attempt with a probability of 1. So that means we're going to perform this copy always. So if we would only operate in this way, so only accepting copy attempts that decrease the overall energy, what would happen to the system is that it would converge to some local optimum, and then it would not be modified anymore, because any change at that state would only lead to a higher energy. In other words, it would become trapped in a local optimum, a local minimum. So to prevent that from happening, this Metropolis algorithm here also considers copy attempts that increase the energy of the system with a certain probability. So let's look at this example on the right-hand side. We have this red pixel which is trying to copy itself into this white pixel. So on the left-hand side we have this one edge which has two different colors on its endpoints, and this edge is going to become another edge with two red endpoints, so the energy of this edge will be lower. But now this red node suddenly has 7 neighbors that are white. So it's going to be an overall increase in energy, so it's going to be the second case that applies here. And what we can see is that this copy attempt now is going to be accepted with this probability, e to the minus delta h divided by t. This t is a parameter, and we can also call this the temperature of the system. So that means the higher this value, the more likely it will be that this copy attempt is going to be accepted. So that means it's going to, if the temperature is low, then it's going to be sometimes happening, but on average we are not going to have copy attempts like this. So this rule of the Metropolis algorithm, combined with the Hamiltonian function that we defined, means that elements that have the same state, so the same identity, will want to be together on this grid, because that will be an energetically favorable configuration. Okay, so far so good. So now let's look at one example of this POTS model, and I'm going to show here an Ising model, which is basically just a special case of the POTS model where we have two different colors, just like in the previous slide. So we're going to run a simulation of this Metropolis algorithm on a two-dimensional rectangular grid, this grid here. And we are going to initialize the grid using random colors. So basically each pixel on the grid now has gotten a random color, either red or white. So what would you expect when you run the Metropolis algorithm on this grid? So what the Metropolis algorithm should do is it should favor configurations where the adjacent pixels have the same color. So if you look at the configuration at this grid right now, it's very chaotic, and every pixel has a randomly colored neighbor. So what should happen now, if we run the simulation, is that these pixels self-organize into patches of the same color. So let's do that. And exactly that's what you see is happening. So the smaller patches of red in white or white in red are disappearing, and instead the system self-organizes into larger, more stable patches that are also still changing, but changing at an increasingly slower pace. Now let's run another simulation where we're also going to look at the effect of changing the temperature. So we start again from a random configuration, but now let's increase the temperature as the simulation is running. So what you can immediately see is this effect, that the boundaries of these regions are going to become more rugged. And that's because at these boundaries you can also have copy attempts that actually increase the energy, so basically red pixels foraying into the white territory, and these are still going to be accepted. But still the qualitative behavior of the system remains the same, so we still see these red patches consolidating and actually ultimately disappearing. So the end state of this simulation is going to be an entirely white grid. So now that we understand the mechanisms behind the basic POTS model, let's move again to the cellular POTS model. And actually the difference between a cellular POTS model and a basic POTS model is not that big, because the only thing that we do is we add another term to this Hamiltonian. And everything else, the grid, the identities, and also the Metropolis algorithm, they remain just the same. So the only difference is that we add another term to this Hamiltonian. This next term here is going to be something that we call a volume term. And this volume term counts the number of pixels of a certain type, I, and this number is going to be compared to a certain target. So for example, let's say that we want approximately 200 pixels to have the color red. Then we would set this parameter vt to 200. And if the actual number of the pixels is different from 200, then we are going to penalize that by using a square difference between the actual number of red pixels and the target number of red pixels. So that means that copy attempts that, for example, are going to shrink the cell or enlarge the cell away from its target volume are going to be penalized. If we do that, we can now make cells, because now we have a way to enforce that there is a certain amount of red or green cells, for example, in this simulation here. And this is what makes the POTS model the cellular POTS model. And actually in the simplest form, this is already it. So the first paper that was published on the cellular POTS model was just using these two things. So only the basic POTS model added with this volume term. There's still one important difference between this simple cellular POTS model and the ones that we've seen in the beginning of this lecture. Because if you look at these cells, their membranes, so their borders are moving because of random fluctuation, but the cells are not really moving per se. So if you would track these cells for a very long time, you would see that they displace a little bit and they move in a totally random fashion, which we could call a Brownian motion. But they don't really move in the same way, and certainly not in the complex way of this example simulation that we've seen in the beginning. So how do we achieve actual motion of cells in this model? And to do this, we need yet another extension of the Hamiltonian term. And here I'm not going to really give you the formula of this extension, so if you want to, you can look it up in this reference here. But I'm only going to give you this idea. So the idea is that we basically reward pixels that have recently had a successful copy attempt. So basically in an area where we have a pixel that has only recently copied itself into this location, then we are going to give this pixel a reward the next time that it tries to copy itself into the next location. And we do that by basically memorizing the time in the simulation at which this pixel has been created. So a pixel that has been created recently has a larger chance to create an offspring of itself in the next time step, whereas another pixel that has been created quite a long time ago will have a lower chance of successfully copying itself into the neighborhood. So if you do that, then what you get is a so-called positive feedback. So pixels that are successful in copying themselves, they will become even more successful in the future by that mechanism. And pixels that have not been successful, they will also not be so successful in the future time steps. So this positive feedback is biologically inspired by the actin molecule. Actin is a molecule that is responsible for the migration of real cells, and it polymerizes against the membrane of the cell. So as I said, I'm not going to give you the formula because it's a fairly long formula, but you can look it up in this paper here. But the basic idea of this positive feedback is that we have two parameters. So one is a basic multiplier, this lambda here, which is just the importance of this term in the Hamiltonian compared to the other terms like the volume term and the basic POTS model term. And then we have another parameter that basically just says how long do we remember at what time the pixel has been created. So does that go back, for example, 5 steps in time or 10 steps in time or 100 steps in time? And I'm just now going to show here on the right hand side we have this cell which is now just a basic cellular POTS model cell without this actin extension built into it. And here I can control this parameter called maxAct, and so let's increase that a little bit and see what happens. So now we are starting to get this positive feedback. And as you can see, you can get what we call symmetry breaking. So we are seeing regions where this positive feedback starts to happen, and these regions now start to pull the cell into a certain direction. So if you see this cell, it's still fairly much moving at random, so it's going to change its direction fairly often, but in between it at least has certain phases of uninterrupted motion going into a consistent direction. So this type of motion in cell biology is called an amoeboid cell migration. So this cell moves a little bit like an amoeba. And what will happen if I increase this parameter even more? Well, so now the positive feedback is also going to be increased, because now the cell remembers its basically younger and older pixels for a large amount of time. And what that does is that this expanding front at the front of the cell becomes even more stable and doesn't break down so quickly. So you now get a cell that is being pulled by this quite stable expanding front into a consistent direction. And you also see that the shape of this cell has kind of changed. So this cell now looks a bit like a half moon. Well, if you have a lot of fantasy, then you would be able to see that. And in cell biology, cells that have this kind of shape and this kind of migration are called keratocytes. So we have actually been able to reproduce two different types of cell motion using this fairly simple model. The one is amoeboid cell migration, and the other one keratocyte-like cell migration. Okay, so at this point you know everything that you need to know about the cellular POTS model, and in the exercises you're going to be implementing your own cellular POTS models. And here I'm just going to show you one more realistic example of a cellular POTS model simulation that we have been building, and this is an actual image-based simulation. That means that as an input to initialize the position of our cells, we're using a real image of tissue. So here you can see cells in a human tonsil. There are different types of cells in here. I'm not going to explain in detail what they are, but they are basically a mix of T cells and B cells. And so we start from this image, and we create first a map using a cell segmentation algorithm where the cells are, and then we use that to initialize a cellular POTS model simulation. And as you can see, we can quite easily scale these simulations to quite large systems. But to do that, we actually need to use a parallel implementation on graphical computing hardware, because otherwise this size of a system would not be feasible. I just wanted to show this as an example of what can be done using cellular automata. So it's really not just a game of life, but you can really make quite complicated, realistic simulations and actually base them on real data. Alright, that already brings me to the end of this lecture, so let me summarize. The cellular POTS model is a cellular automaton, you could say, but it's also not very standard because it has a stochastic update rule and also, more importantly, an asynchronous update rule. So unlike a lot of other cellular automata, not all pixels on the grid are updated at the same time. The cellular POTS model is very flexible, and it can and has been adapted to very different biological scenarios by adding terms to its Hamiltonian function. So cellular POTS models have been used to model plant growth, dictyostelium, self-organizing slime mold, well, cell migration, and many other things. And also nice about this model is that it has been used not only by one person or a few people, but by many different groups over quite many years. So there have been many extensions developed, and people have actually been building on each other's work. And in the assignment that belongs to this lecture, you will implement your own simulations using either a framework that we developed to make this easy, or of course you're also welcome to make your own in your own favorite programming language. So that's it from me. I hope that I can see you all face to face again at some time, but in the meantime we are going to keep in touch using electronic communication. And I would be glad if you would consider choosing one of these topics for your projects in the second half of this course. Thank you for your attention.